Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Heather Quinn. I'm on the School of Design faculty here at DePaul. I am going to give you a little overview about our series that's coming up. We have an amazing lineup this year, primarily of international speakers. So we have somebody coming from Belgium, a UX designer. We have some designers coming from Switzerland, and we have a designer with some work in the MoMA who's coming from China. So our lineup that's coming for winter and spring is pretty amazing. I also wanted to let you know that immediately after this, Anna Anthropy is having her Tea and Consequences board games going on. So I'm going to pass some flyers around about that. So you're welcome to join her after that. We have Kenny McAlpine tonight. I have met Kenny. We've corresponded over email for the last couple of months, and we immediately got along because he's Scottish and I'm from Boston, and so we were able to speak primarily in sarcasm, and we understood each other pretty well. We already feel like we're really long lost friends. He is pretty amazing, and he's been with us for the last week or so, really kind of immersing himself in DePaul, and he has some great stuff to share for you. I'm going to introduce you to Brian Schrenk, who's been working with him this week. He's also on the School of Design faculty, and he's going to let you know a little bit about Kenny before Kenny speaks.
Thank you so much, Heather. So I apologize because we stole Kenny's voice yesterday. We abused him and used him all day as he gave feedback to student projects. So you can thank him as he suffers today through his presentation. So thank you and sorry, as I usually have to say together. All right. I'm going to read the bio. I'll try to look up. I couldn't memorize this, so here we go. Dr. Kenny McAlpine joined Abertay University in Dundee, Scotland, as part of the original team who developed the university's degree programs in computer game technology and computer arts in the late 1990s. And it's the #1 game school in Europe. So he's real humble. It's actually, he's an amazing guy. He's even this is humble, and this is very long. So. All right, where he leads teaching and research in sound production and music performance. Kenny is the very definition of a high-functioning geek. He looks and behaves fairly normal on the surface, except for the hair. The hair is pretty out there. I love it. But it doesn't take very much to scratch beneath that veneer and unleash a multitude of compulsive and infectious enthusiasms. Everything from artisan bread making, and I can reliably inform you that you all need to try his hand-shaped baguettes, to Hammond organ technique. Kenny began life as a mathematician and very nearly took up a career in corporate finance, but came to the realization quite early on that he should use his skills for good rather than evil, and settled upon a more interesting, if less financially rewarding, life in academia. He did a PhD in algorithmic music composition at the University of Glasgow, bringing together his love of music, maths, and technology, and has continued to work at that interesting point where different disciplines collide. He has developed interactive soundtracks for live theater, film, and video games, a music streaming app for newborn babies and young children, developed in partnership with the Scottish Government and the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, and a unique digital harpsichord exhibit for the National Trust in London, England. Despite having kids, Kenny still finds time to perform live from time to time as a jazz organist and can often be found playing covers of classic 8-bit video game themes, about which he is currently writing a book for Oxford University Press. When do you think that'll come out? All right, it's going to be good. More game audio books. When he's not thinking about music, Kenny can generally be found rolling around the hills of Fife on a mountain bike with a GoPro strapped to his handlebars, huffing his way around a marathon course with a GoPro strapped to his chest, or slow roasting joints of meat, normally without a GoPro. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause and welcome Kenny McAlpine.
No. Oh, you got it. On mic top. Okay, well, thanks, Brian, for those kind and maybe too accurate words of introduction. I do need to begin with an apology because I came down with a heavy cold earlier in the week. And then, as Brian said, he had me talking to students for about 8 hours solid yesterday. So my voice is on the husky side, and I can't help feel but that I'm depriving you of the full experience of my lyrical Scottish brogue. I'd also like, at this point, just to take the opportunity to extend a note of thanks to the College of Computing and Digital Media for hosting me for the last couple of weeks. It's been really wonderful to have the chance to observe and to contribute to your teaching and your special events. And I think that I'll be leaving here certainly with some very valuable professional contacts, but I hope also some new friends. Now, before I arrived here, I was really looking forward to visiting Chicago, and I'm pleased to say that it hasn't disappointed. I've always associated Chicago with music, but more than that, I've always associated the city with musical innovation. After all, it was here on Maxwell Street that you guys electrified the blues, and just along the road on South Jefferson that Frankie Knuckles took disco and drove it really hard to create that Chicago house style. Now, I really, really love that idea of innovation, of creating novelty and value just by looking at things differently. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's an approach to design that brings together technology, creativity, lateral thinking, and I think most importantly of all, experimental play. Now, ultimately, we're going to explore how the Game Boy was the catalyst that transformed the way that we think about and experience video game music. But before we get to that, let's first set out a bit of context and think about how that early video game sound came about. Let's look at what design challenges presented to those early video game designers. Now I'm going to start the story with Pong. Pong wasn't the first video game. It wasn't even the first video game with sound. But Pong managed to muscle its way into the public consciousness in a way that none of its predecessors had. Before Pong came along, the domain of the video game was the university computing lab, because the computing hardware required to run games ran to tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And back in the 1960s, that was an awful lot of money. Pong was developed by Alan Alcorn. He's the cheery-looking chap with a beard on the right-hand side of this photo. He was a young engineer who left a good job at Ampex to work for Atari, a startup company in the games industry at a time when startups weren't a thing and the games industry didn't even exist. Now, Alcorn was working at a time before microprocessors. There were no development tools to draw upon and no tried and tested workflows and no design rules. They were working at a digital frontier and they were making up the rules as they went along based on what worked and what didn't. To develop the hardware for the game, Alcorn designed a prototype around a cheap state machine, a jumble of transistors and diode arrays, and a black and white television set that he bought for $75 from a Walgreens store. His bosses wanted him to design sophisticated sound effects for the game. They wanted the roar of a crowd of thousands when you won a point, and a boo and a hiss whenever you lost one. But Alcorn didn't have the electronic components or the know-how to create those sound effects. Instead, what he did was to poke around in the sync generator inside his circuit, and he used the waveforms that were already sitting there. Now, this then was design born out of necessity, an accident of fate that would, because of Pong's runaway commercial success, shape the expectations of video game sound going forward. And in all honesty, things didn't change all that much in the years that followed. When Atari launched the VCS in 1977, it had a sound chip that was integrated with its display. It derived its musical frequencies mathematically from the video display rate. And to cut a long and technical explanation short, that made the Atari VCS sound absolutely awful. Most of the pitches that it could generate fell in the gaps in between the chromatic notes, and so music written for the Atari sounded at best slightly exotic, but usually just dreadfully out of tune. Writing music on the Atari was really like playing a piano with a bunch of broken keys. It was a difficult process, and it was one that was actually pretty thankless. Even in that analogy, though, we've got the makings of a lateral design solution. Think about it. If you've got a piano with a bunch of broken keys, then it doesn't make sense to try and play a piece of music that someone's written for a regular piano. If you do that, it'll sound terrible. Instead, flip that idea on its head and write a piece of music that uses just the notes that work. And that's what began to happen on the VCS. During a presentation at the Game Developer Conference in 2011, David Crane explained that the developer of Activision's pressure cooker, Gary Kitchen, did exactly that. He sat down and calculated the 9 notes of the VCS that would play roughly in tune, and then marked them on a Casio keyboard. He then hired a jingle composer to come in and write a melody for the game using just those 9 notes. Now, it might be simple, but that music sounds like music. And it's significant because this was the first time that a professional composer had been hired to make video games sound good. This then marks the beginning of the professionalization of video game sound. Over in the UK, it was the ZX Spectrum, a machine that was released over here as the Timex 2048, that really kick-started the games industry. Now, the ZX Spectrum's sound was even more restrictive still. It had just a single-channel beeper speaker, and it could only produce square wave tones at a fixed volume. To make matters worse, there was no dedicated sound hardware. That speaker hung off one of the pins of the CPU. And so when the Spectrum was beeping, it couldn't do anything else. If you had sound, no gameplay, and vice versa. And yet, just 2 or 3 years further down the road from launch, game designers on the Spectrum had worked out how to go from this to this. Now, I think it's pretty amazing how quickly things developed on the Spectrum. But again, it's all down to lateral thinking and creative coding. And to illustrate how, let's turn to the one reliable source that can give us a perspective on all aspects of life. That's right, Looney Tunes. Some of you might have seen this classic short, Canned Feud. It begins with Sylvester lying sleeping on the settee. With each snore, he blows a feather into the air and then sucks it back as he inhales. Now, essentially, this is how a loudspeaker works. You've got a paper cone, the feather, attached to a magnet, Sylvester. As an audio signal arrives at the speaker, it drives the magnet to create a variable magnetic field, the snoring. And that pushes the speaker cone in and out to generate the physical sound wave. But let's pause and think about that for a moment. It takes a short amount of time for the feather or the speaker cone to move from rest to its point of maximum displacement and back again. So if Sylvester were to snore in shorter, quicker bursts, that feather could be made to jump to the halfway point, or indeed any point in between. Now that's the creative step here. The coders realized that they could measure those speaker transition times, the speaker inertia. And by measuring how long it took to execute each line of code, they could reverse engineer tables of values that would let them create sophisticated but lo-fi digital audio waveforms. And from that point on, it was really all about just playing with that idea. And all of a sudden, people were writing music with 5 or 6 different independent audio channels with percussion and effects, none of which were actually supported by the hardware. This machine, the Commodore 64, was the most powerful out-of-the-box music machine of its generation. It felt like a hardware synth that just happened to come with a home computer built around it. Its SID chip had proper amplitude envelopes and programmable filters that could be applied to multiple waveforms, triangles, sawtooths, pulse waves, and noise. With all of that complexity on board, it took developers time to explore its capabilities. But even in the very earliest games, you can see how musicians looked to the popular music of the time to help add movement to the tracks. Now this is Lazy Jones, a game about a hotel caretaker who dodges work to play through a series of mini-games. The music is simple, but it's pretty effective. It riffs off the pop melodies of the period, Nana's 99 Red Balloons, Visage's Fade to Grey, and Gene Page's disco remix of Close Encounters of the Third Kind are all in there. And the music adapts to the gameplay. There's a strong melody and a bouncing bass line that plays along in broken octaves. Now that bass line is the thing that provides a sense of continuity and movement to what might otherwise be quite a static, synthetic track. Now that type of bouncing bass was already a staple of 1980s era synth pop. Think New Order's Blue Monday. And as composers riffed off that music to create their game soundtracks, it became one of the key characteristics of that 8-bit video game sound. But even though it was powerful, the Commodore 64 was still pretty limited. It only had 3 sound channels, and those 3 voices had to cover everything. The melody, the bass, the percussion, the harmony, and of course the sound effects. And that made creating rich harmonic arrangements really pretty difficult. But musicians realized that there were still tricks that they could use to create dense, complex musical arrangements. One simple trick was multiplexing, creating virtual tracks by splitting and sharing physical track space between multiple different musical lines. So, for example, let's say that somebody had created a drum line. Then all of those drum sounds could be synthesized and arranged and condensed down into one audio channel. But there would still be empty space between, say, the kick drum and the snare, or the snare and the hi-hats. And so the composer could fill in that empty space and fit in some comp chords or a stab or maybe part of the bass line. And by working like that, filling in the blanks across the 3 physical channels, it was possible to squeeze 5 or maybe 6 different channels of music into those 3 physical track spaces. But then they also didn't stop there. Composers also realized that they could thicken up arrangements by creating chords on a single channel. And those of you who are as old and as geeky as me might have come across Jean-Michel Jarre, a French electronic musician who writes ambient music. One of his tracks, Arpeggiator, was used in the soundtrack to the film 9½ Weeks. Now, for those of you who have never come across an arpeggiator, it's an electronic music device that takes a bunch of notes from a chord played on a keyboard and then arranges them as a melodic sequence that is tempo synced to the rest of the music. Jarre used these a lot to create those floaty, textural effects in his compositions. But game composers realized that you could use them in a different way. What if, rather than syncing the arpeggiated notes to the composition, you just cycled through them really, really fast? Well, what happens is you get a chordal effect, a slightly weird chordal effect, admittedly, because it has this sort of shimmery, wibbly, wobbly weirdness to it. But it's a chord effect, nevertheless. Now that sound, maybe more than anything, has come to characterize the sound of chip music. But again, it's almost an accident, a consequence of the technical solution that musicians developed to push beyond the constraints of the limited hardware. Now this next example I'm going to play is from Rob Hubbard's soundtrack to Commando on the Commodore 64. And it shows how by bringing together all of these techniques, along with some classic sound synthesis, it was possible to create some really quite interesting music. Now I've put this up as an oscilloscope view. So if you look closely, you'll be able to see how, for example, the percussion is split across different tracks. You'll be able to see where vibrato and pulse width modulation are used to animate the sound. But most importantly, you should be able to see just how busy everything is. There isn't a moment of empty space anywhere. And that really is the essence of chiptune. It's about pushing limited hardware as far as possible and squeezing as much musical energy as you can from a very limited palette of sounds. And so on. Now, by the time Nintendo's Game Boy arrived in 1989, most of this compositional innovation had already taken place, and that 8-bit sound was already very well established. But the Game Boy's contribution to chiptune was just as important as these other gaming platforms that we've already touched on. The Game Boy was the machine that took 8-bit music from the desktop and put it on stage. Now looking back at the Game Boy today, nearly 30 years on from its launch, I think it's easy to look at its chunky and brick-like design and forget just how profoundly it revolutionized handheld gaming. Now it wasn't the first handheld console, but it brought handheld gaming to the mainstream. Back in 1989, the Game Boy was everywhere. Now, of course, the Game Boy didn't arrive out of nowhere. Its DNA is woven through all of the grey plastic and the printed circuit track lines of all of the portable gaming devices that went before it. And if you follow them, those track lines lead back here to Mattel's Auto Race. Now, in the wake of the first wave of home video gaming in the mid-1970s, the toy giant Mattel, which had made its name in the 1950s and 60s with toys like Barbie and Hot Wheels, had been eyeing the video games market keenly from the sidelines, convinced that its experience in tactile play could bring a new dimension to home gaming. The trouble was, Mattel didn't have any expertise in video game design. Well, few people did back then. And so they looked for a partner. Their choice? Well, who else? The defense contractor, Rockwell Industries. Now, of course, Rockwell didn't have any experience in video game design either, but they did at least know how to manufacture microprocessors and electronic components. They also had a guy called Mark Lesser, a product design engineer who jumped at the chance to make a game. Lesser had spent the last few years working with pocket calculator chips, and he knew those inside out. But because of the cost involved in designing a new single-chip computer, he had no option but to turn to one of those calculator chips to power the new game. So he used the chip, and he turned the calculator display on its side to create the playfield. That's the window that you can see on the middle right of the console. Autorace then was essentially a pocket calculator turned on its side with the buttons replaced with an analog thumb controller and a couple of switches. It had limited I/O, it had next to no RAM, and it had a clock that ran so slowly it could be measured in geological time. Lesser's challenge was to take all of this and turn it into something playable. And somehow, he did it. He squeezed all of the game code that he needed into just 511 bytes of memory. Now that's not 511K, but 511 bytes of memory. Autorace was a definite risk for Mattel. Nobody knew if it would work, let alone whether it would be a marketable product. But of course it did, and it was. And so the following year, Milton Bradley launched Simon, that classic 4-button musical memory game. It was released in a blaze of publicity at a midnight party in Studio 54, one of New York's hippest night spots. Now that high-profile launch helped along in no small part, I think, by the climactic game of intergalactic Simon that played out at the end of that year's movie blockbuster, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, helped Simon to become a true pop culture phenomenon. And in the process, it cemented that link between music and electronic play. Now, encouraged by the phenomenal success of Simon, Milton Bradley launched Microvision in November 1979. Now, Microvision was the first true handheld console system in the sense that it provided a base unit on which could be played different game cartridges. Now, unlike almost every other cartridge-based system before or since, the Microvision body was little more than a housing for the 16 by 16 monochrome LCD display, a small speaker, and the game controls. The game code and the CPU needed to execute it were both housed in the cartridge itself and connected to the console body via copper pins. Now that left the cartridge circuit really very vulnerable to electrostatic discharge. Truth be told, it was a system that was a bit ahead of its time, and technical problems and a lack of game cartridges meant that it didn't sell particularly well, and eventually it was discontinued in 1981. And by that point, the very start of the 1980s, the cost of those LCD screens had fallen to a point where it had become feasible to use the technology to replace the more common LED displays in handheld games. Now, LCDs allowed the display of custom objects and shapes, giving finer detail and greater resolution, but their flexibility was still limited. On an LCD screen, all of the graphical objects needed to be preformed and configured at a particular point in the display field. And so every possible location and every state of the game had to be preset. But although that restricted the nature and the visual complexity of the gameplay, what it did was focus the designers on creating visually simple but very engaging and playable games. Gunpei Yokoi was a product design engineer at Nintendo, and he bought into that idea completely. He practiced a design philosophy called lateral thinking with withered technology. He would take cheap, well-established and well-understood technologies and then apply them in novel and innovative ways. One morning, as he sat on the train to work, he watched another passenger idly pass the time by playing with the buttons on his pocket calculator. Now, Yokoi realized that if he reshaped those display segments, he could create a graphical interface that would give his fellow passengers something more engaging to play with than just numbers. The result was Ball, the first in Nintendo's Game & Watch series. It was designed by Yokoi around commoditized components and stripped of any excess. It was a simple game at low cost, but one that had very little compromise in terms of engaging gameplay and playability. Now, Ball was a simple juggling game that needed only simple controls, a left and a right button. But Yokoi wanted more. He wanted to recreate the gaming experience of some of Nintendo's most popular coin-ops, games like Donkey Kong. But he realized that he couldn't just drop a joystick onto the top of a pocket game. That would hurt its pocketability. And so he designed and developed a flat alternative, what we now call the directional pad or D-pad controller. The Game Boy was the machine that brought all of these components together into a single package. It was the embodiment of Yokoi's philosophy. It had a similar form factor and color scheme to Mattel's Auto Race. It had the same D-pad controller as Donkey Kong. And it took the idea of swappable cartridges introduced in the Microvision and made them all work together in perfectly judged harmony. In terms of its technology, the Game Boy was really only ever adequate. Its LCD screen had 4 shades of grayscale, although greenscale is perhaps a more accurate description because it lent all of the graphics a pretty sickly pallor. It wasn't as high res as the color LCD in Atari's Lynx, but then nor did the Game Boy chew through batteries like a teething puppy does the household furniture. Yokoi's design philosophy led him to the realization that effective hardware design was not just about making the most powerful device possible. By considering hardware, software, and user requirements together, he was able to create a device that was accessible and cheap, both to buy and to play. By designing a console around mature and well-understood technology, Nintendo were then able to concentrate their efforts on designing simple and playable games, games that made the most of the Game Boy's limited hardware. Now, few games have defined a platform as completely as Tetris did the Game Boy. And I think part of Nintendo's marketing genius was to bundle the machine with what was undoubtedly its killer app. The straight edges of the tetrominoes work perfectly on the Game Boy's low-res screen, and with shape and orientation driving gameplay, the screen's motion blur and its limited tonal range just didn't matter. Tetris is the perfect blend of simplicity and challenge. It's a game whose appeal transcends age, gender, maybe even skill. Tetris, then, was the first game that nearly everybody played when they turned on their Game Boy for the first time. And its default music track, an arrangement of an old Russian folk song called Korobanyiki, would have been the first piece of music that they heard. And of course, they would have heard it over and over and over again. In fact, today, when most people hear that tune, their first thought is Tetris. Now, that's great for Nintendo. It's not so good for Russian culture. And then, just to erode Russian culture that bit further, 2 singles were released that took the music of Tetris and gave it mass appeal. In 1991, an Italian house duo, Eugenio Pasalacqua and Andrea Prezioso, released a dance version of Tetris as the Game Boys. Now really, that track is a music producer's dream. It's so easy to make. It's little more than a sample of the original Game Boy soundtrack with a 4-on-the-floor house beat behind it. And it became an underground sensation and spawned a whole series of remixes. It was a collision of club culture and video game culture, and it showed that video game music could be something more than just functional media music. It showed that it could be popular music in its own right. Now, if that was a message that needed driving home, then boy was it driven home the next year when Dr. Spin released a Eurodance cover of Tetris that got to number 6 in the UK charts. Now, Dr. Spin was actually little more than a front end for the British composer and theatre impresario Andrew Lloyd Webber and his collaborator, producer Nigel Wright. Now, love him or loathe him, I think there's no denying that Lord Lloyd Webber has an ability to read the shifting sands of popular culture. And with both Eurodance and gaming in their ascendancy at the time, Tetris brought the two together head on in a, let's be honest, frankly bizarre way.
I know you're going to dig this.
Now, I'm always amazed at just what passed for musical, cutting-edge musical entertainment in the past. I'm tempted to ask what sort of drugs they were on, but I think it was all of them. By 1997, the Game Boy was reaching the end of its production life, but when Oliver Witchow, a design student at the University of Fine Arts in Hamburg, looked at it, he didn't see a chunky, underpowered gaming machine. He saw something different. He saw a lightweight, portable synthesizer. And so for his undergraduate project in product design, he decided to try and hack the Game Boy and turn it into a portable music workstation. Now, it was an idea that had been running around his head for a while. As a kid, he had plugged his brother's Game Boy into a stereo system and for the first time really listened to that Super Mario sound. Now, it wasn't like the techno that he normally listened to, but there was something about its lo-fi sound that spoke to him. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the Game Boy, beneath its plastic case, was just a computer. It might have a small screen and no keyboard, but it had a processor and it ran programs from cartridges, so surely it should be possible to program it. Vitchoff began coding directly on the Game Boy in BASIC. Now, to say that it was clumsy would be an understatement. His code was entered using the D-pad and the A and the B buttons, a single character at a time, much like sending an SMS message on an old cell phone. And his first programs were unstable and very slow. But from the first moment he started, he was absolutely hooked. He entered his early prototype, which he called Nanoloop, at a lo-fi music contest at the Liquid Sky Club in Cologne in the spring of 1998. Now, at the time, he was nursing a heavy cold, and he remembers the software glitching almost to the point of collapse. But the crowd loved it. They loved the sound, but maybe more importantly, they loved the fact that they were seeing a familiar toy being reimagined as a musical device. Spiritually, Vitchoff was applying Gunpei Yokoi's philosophy and breathing new life into that tired old platform. Now, the key to Nanoloop's appeal is its interface, a step sequencer arranged as a 4x4 grid and controlled using the D-pad and the A and B buttons. It's a game-inspired interface that encourages a playful and improvisatory approach to composition, and it lends itself very well to performance. It's an approach that Vitchoff describes as minimal control. Users play with the sound, and the music happens almost as a consequence of that play, a byproduct of the gamification of composition. Now, it's a novel solution, but it does bring with it challenges. Let's take a look at this. Now, what you saw there was me tracking some music live in Little Sound DJ, a music tracker for the Game Boy. Or did you? Because I could equally well have been doing this. Now, what that Tetris masterclass demonstrates is that there's a definite ambiguity about using a gaming interface to perform music live. Now, let's contrast both of those with this. Now, in many ways, my banjo uke is just like a Game Boy. It's got limited polyphony, very few options for voicing, and I can play it for hours without ever having to change the batteries. But when I play it, there's a direct and a very observable moment of musical creation, one that is tactile and very physical. Now that's something that just isn't explicit on the Game Boy. As I flick my thumbs across the buttons and stare at the screen, you might be witnessing a moment of spontaneous creation, but you might equally be watching me plow through rows in Tetris. Performance on a Game Boy doesn't always translate into a visual focus for the audience. Now, of course, that's not something that is unique to the Game Boy. Musicians who gig with laptops, modular synths, and even, as I once witnessed at an avant-garde electroacoustic performance, the amplified squeaky hinge of a set of stepladders. Those musicians have to address the idea of performativity and design and curate the audience experience when music making is recast on unconventional instruments using unconventional musical gestures. In fact, one of the reasons that synthesizers have evolved around the traditional piano keyboard interface is precisely because performers needed to signal to audiences that they were performing. When he launched his range of modular synths, Bob Moog was keen to look for alternative controllers that didn't limit the machines to discrete tones and pitches and traditional ideas of tonality. But in the end, he had to concede that it looks good if you're playing a keyboard. People understand that then you're making music. You know, without it, you could be tuning in Russia. This pose here graphically ties in the music and the technology. And so as analog synthesizers began to find their way into rock and psychedelia acts in the 1960s, they were largely seen and used as extensions of other electromechanical keyboard instruments and found their way into the rigs of keyboardists. Nevertheless, some musicians, particularly those given over to flamboyant showmanship, looked to extend and play on the expressive capabilities of the synth using alternative modes of control. Moog's own ribbon controller, for example, an enhanced version of the fingerboard theremin, used a resistive strip to create a control voltage that could be used as a controller for a tone module. Keith Emerson here famously used one hooked up to his Moog modular, clamping the 2-foot-long device to his groin and grinding it like Jimi Hendrix as he improvised soaring synth solos. As a device, it afforded more in the way of stagecraft than it did precise musical control, but it did it by substituting one form of familiar musical performance cue, the keyboard, for another, the guitar. But flamboyance isn't the only way to create a stage presence. Some performers make a feature of unconventional gestures. Like many, Kraftwerk considered themselves part of the art scene rather than the music scene when they started out in the late 1960s and early 1970s. By the early 1980s, they had developed an approach to performance that made a feature of the mechanistic relationship between performer, technology, and performance, celebrating the fusion of man-machine and showcasing the mundanity and the routine of their musical interactions. That's an approach that's been adopted by some Game Boy musicians. The Polish ensemble Micro Orchestra, for example, tap into that tradition of mundane performance. On stage, the band remains static and concentrate completely on the Game Boy screen. But the Game Boy brings with it other dimensions too. The sound and the vibe is loaded with fun and positive association, of childhood and of carefree play. Performing on a Game Boy draws on these very powerful emotional bonds, and some musicians have made a feature of that. DJ Scotch Egg, for example, opened his set at the Boiler Room in Berlin in 2014, dressed in a floral apron, and broke off from performance to flip pancakes. Gareth Morris, or Gwem, as he is known in the scene, combines DJing, vocals, and screaming electric guitar. But I think my favourite response to this issue of how you make a video game synth performative is Linus Akason's Chipophone, a homemade synthesizer built into the case of an old electronic organ. Akason ripped out the organ's innards and connected the key contacts, the pedals, the knobs, and the switches to an Atmega 88 microcontroller, which transforms the control signals from the keyboard into MIDI data. He then added a second microcontroller running custom code to synthesize typical chiptune sounds, 8 independent waveform generators capable of generating pulse waves, 4-bit triangle waves, and white noise. He then coded some SID-like features like ring modulation and variable pulse widths, and rendered it all in glorious 12-bit mono, using an intelligent algorithm to allocate voices and arpeggiate chords dynamically as the keys are pressed. Here's a brief extract of him playing Rob Hubbard's International Karate. And what I love about that is the inventive recycling. I think such inventive recycling of hardware is a refreshing counterpoint to the relentless drive of technological progress and an alternative to the highly produced sound of much modern commercial music. Users might drift to new machines that boast more memory, faster processors, and better sound. But yet, who among us hasn't felt creatively crippled by the myriad opportunities that those offer? Spending hours auditioning presets to find just the right sound, rather than focusing on writing tight and engaging music. It's just like Devo sang, freedom of choice is what you got, freedom from choice is what you want. Now for me, that's where the real value in this sort of play lies. By constraining options, we're forced to look for novel solutions. And by revisiting those machines fresh, by poking around in the darkest recesses of the hardware and code, we can breathe new life into them and recast them as characterful musical instruments. Now, I started off talking about Pong and how by looking at a cheap black and white television set and a sync generator from a different perspective, Alan Alcorn was able to design a new way to play. And that's the idea that links together all the stories that I've talked about today. At some point, someone looked at something and they didn't see what everybody else saw. And that shift in perspective helped them create something new. The opportunity to design is all around us. All it takes is an open mind and a willingness to see the world through a fresh set of eyes. And that is me. Anyone got any questions?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm I have a few questions I'm curious about. Like, you're pretty much discussing about the innovations about like utilizing limited space in order to pretty much get the most out of a sound chip. But I'm curious why you never went over the NES, the Sega Genesis, the N64, like what composers did for the NES, like Nobuo Uematsu, like how he viewed he didn't view like the limitations of the NES as pretty much you can't do this. He's like, oh, I got a keyboard now. Or you didn't look over how the Game Boy is pretty much a smaller, more compact NES with no color, or how it influenced how it influenced how game developers utilize the limited resources. Why didn't you go over that?
Because I only had an hour to talk. So if you want to follow up on that, buy my book. So, I mean, yeah, these are all great points, but, I only had an hour, and I had quite a lot of stuff to fit in there. And, given that this is a design school, I wanted to try and give a kind of design flavor to the presentation. So, yeah, we talked about some of those issues yesterday with Brian and some of his classes. We did have a look at that, and Koji Kondo, actually, he approached the process of composing for the NES in a very different way to some of the composers that I've talked about here. The Western composers who worked on the Commodore 64, the Spectrum, and the VCS approached it. So absolutely, the Japanese approach was not to try and squeeze the maximum performance from the chip, but actually to compose to the chip's strengths. However, that's a very different mindset and ethos to that of chiptune, which absolutely is about taking the hardware to the very, very limits. So because of that, because this was a kind of chiptune-y kind of talk, we took that particular angle. But there are these other narratives to explore, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
It's a pleasure.
So I love chiptune music, but I am not super technologically gifted and have no idea how to make it. How would you start making chiptune music with no
There are easy ways, and there are some not so easy ways. The easiest way, I think, so are you a musician already? You know, do you use a DAW? Do you use like Cubase or Logic or Pro Tools or anything like that?
I am not a musician.
Okay. Well, the very first step then, I think, is to work on your musical chops.
Fair enough.
Because, you know, chiptune fundamentally is about really good, strong melodic content, really strong bass lines, and really driving percussion. Okay? So I think the first thing you should do is get yourself something like GarageBand and just sit down with some basic loops and try writing some music first. And try and get stuff that is engaging and fast-paced and cheery. Then, once you get your head around that, invest in something like Logic. And there's a software plugin called Plogue. Now, that's a virtual instrument that takes all of those classic sound chip sounds and packages them up in a very, very easy to use format. And so you can use all of the benefits of desktop composition. So take all those skills that you've learned in GarageBand and then translate them immediately across into your music sequencer of choice. And then you've got all of the sounds, you've got the composition tools that you need, and it's just then all about trying to find those tunes. The slightly more complex way of going about it, but maybe the one that will give you the most benefit in the long run, is either to use a Game Boy emulator or a NES emulator, or to find one of the trackers that run on either Mac or PC. So Goat Tracker would be a good example. That's a SID chip emulator. And what those let you do is download other people's open source compositions and look note by note and sound by sound about how they've put together their own compositions. This is how most people learn to compose for chiptune initially anyway. There are lots of guides and tutorials online which you can use and follow. The sound tracker interface is actually pretty straightforward because it just treats music a bit like a spreadsheet. So you've got this multiple 64-step grid usually, where each step is just a time section of the music, and you just drop sounds and samples in place. So you don't need to know very much about traditional music theory to work like that. But it is a bit more technical, and you do need to have a better understanding of the hardware and its limitations to use it effectively. You get more respect if you do that too. People don't rate people who compose in that fake bit style, which is the way of doing it on a desktop computer using a set of pre-sequenced sounds. So yeah, but yeah, just dive in and play is the best advice I could give you.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm okay.
Sorry.
My throat's been better.
I'm sure. Can you kind of talk about how the digital revolution, I suppose, kind of in the early 2000s and up to now has kind of affected the more analog route as you've kind of described through your presentation?
Yeah, you know, actually, I think one of the really interesting things about this is that, you know, when you look at the whole chiptune story, it didn't just start with Pong. You know, we started with Pong today because I had to start my story somewhere. But actually, a lot of the techniques that we talked about were actually developed by the early pioneers of electronic music at Bell Labs and MIT back in the 50s and the 60s. What you had with the guys who were composing on the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum in the mid-1980s, well, they were riffing off the ideas that had been set up with electronic analog music in the 1970s. So bands like Kraftwerk, but Yellow Magic Orchestra, Tangerine Dream, stuff like that. You also had the New Romantic bands as well who fed into that. And so what you had then was the 1980s, you had a bunch of kids working in that space professionally, not really being aware of copyright restrictions or anything like that. So just taking ideas from everywhere and reinventing them and re-expressing them through the prism of the sound chip. And then eventually, when the PlayStation came along with its CD-ROM, it kind of normalized the idea that video game music should sound like production music. And so that chip sound kind of disappeared, at least from games. But it didn't go away. It became part of the demo scene, which was this underground countercultural movement that were creating real-time works of art using video games, or at least video game hardware. So the sound moved underground. Because of that then, it took on an element of cool that it never ever had when it was just part of the video game scene. And then as machines like the Amiga, I don't think the Amiga was particularly big over here in the States, but it was huge in Europe. People started to use the Amiga live and as part of their DJ sets. And so the Amiga and its sound set and those chip sounds started to influence the sound of the electronic music that was being produced at the time. So that was largely sort of jungle and drum and bass. And then that and the new rave scene of the early 1990s, when chiptune re-emerged in the 2000s as this live performative thing, well, the kids were taking those sounds and using that as their point of reference and beginning to re-express those again through the prism of Game Boys and Commodore 64s and things like that. So for me, the really interesting thing is just this kind of creative back and forth, but essentially it's kids doing what kids have always done. They look to the music of like 2 generations back and then reinvent it and express it for themselves. So that for me is the more interesting thing. It's not so much about whether they used analog or digital or whatever. It's just that playful way of looking back at the music of earlier and then re-expressing it for yourself.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Hello. First of all, I want to say I really enjoyed that talk. I thought it was really interesting.
Thank you.
I actually have 2 questions.
Okay, I'll permit you that, but I've just been advised that this has to be your last. But
Okay.
you squeaked in under the radar and you can have both, as long as they're not too long or difficult.
Okay. Yeah. Well. Okay. My first question is kind of relative, actually. How being on a college student budget, how expensive would it be, I guess, to sort of get into producing this kind of music?
Not expensive at all. That's the beautiful thing. You know, you can pick up a second-hand Game Boy for $5. So go out and buy one. You can get the software for free, and then that's all you need. You've got a live music set. It's all just about the amount of time that you want to invest in learning how to use it fluently and coming up with musical ideas. So it's very, very cost effective. So in that respect, it's very DIY, and in actual fact, it probably has more with other DIY musical movements like punk. So it's a very punk style.
Cool. And my other, I don't know. My other question was sort of like, what are the similarities, I guess, of composing music on like a handheld device versus making something entirely in like a DAW, like Logic or something?
Yeah, it's kind of like what I described earlier when Oliver Vitchoff started to program on the Game Boy. It is, writing music like that is like texting on an old cell phone. So it can be quite a long-winded and not very user-friendly process. However, if you use one of the trackers, because of the limited display, there's only so much of the screen that you can display at any one time. So composition becomes part working with the software, part learning the interface, but then it also becomes a bit like a memory game because you have to remember the navigation structure to navigate to exactly where you want to go. And when you watch some of the guys who are really, really fluent, it becomes almost second nature, and it's a joy to watch them just kind of navigate the system and work with it, regardless of what they're doing musically. So I think it's a really good question, but the only thing I could say to you in response is, you know, go out. The cheapest way is just to get a Game Boy emulator and a copy of the Little Sound DJ or Nano Loop ROM. Just play with it on your desktop and see how it is. And if you really like it, go get yourself a real Game Boy and play with it that way.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenny. I always know it's a good talk when I take a million notes in my phone, so I have a lot of
Ooh,
your quotes
did you? Wow,
in
right,
here.
great.
I did. I think you're speaking to a pretty diverse school of design. We have game, we have UX, we have graphic design, and so I think your talk really spoke to a lot of things, especially with sound right now with Alexa and Siri. I'm speaking to our graphic design crowd in particular. Trying to understand the importance of sound is really important. One of the things you did say, though, was by constraining options, we are forced to look for new solutions. And so I think, especially for our designers, as faculty, we give them constraints a lot and they complain. And I think that you just touched on the beauty of that, why it's so
Yeah,
important. So that really, really stuck out to me. So we really appreciate having you all the way from Scotland.
Thank you.
I also wanted to remind all of you of Anna's talk up in Daily 213 right now. Not her talk, but her Tea and Consequences, which is pretty amazing. And that also on November 9th, we have an internship panel about getting hired. We have designers from Thirst and from IDEO. So if you're interested in meeting with them, it's pretty relevant for all majors to learning to get hired, some of the etiquette and the pros and cons. So just a reminder for that, November 9th. You can find all of that at SD Talks on our Facebook groups. If you're not on that, you should look for that too. So again, thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.